So you're probably wondering why the tour has brought us out of the shipyard, out of Belfast, and down 10 miles down the shores of Belfast Lough to this little beach. Well, this is Bonneybefore, and this is a very important place in my family's Titanic story, because it's from here that my 5-year-old grandfather watched Titanic sail away with his father on board. They'd said their goodbyes earlier that day, and Tommy Miller had left them with a very specific instruction. He said, "I want you each to have 2 new pennies, and I don't want you to spend them until we're all together again." So my grandfather described how he stood on this beach on the 2nd of April 1912 and watched the big ships sailing past, and he was clutching those 2 pennies so tightly all the time that the date was almost burnt into his hand. They would have been big pennies like these old ones from 1912. And my grandfather describes how he watched Titanic sailing away down Belfast Lough, and as he did so he was clutching his 2 pennies so tightly in his hand that the date of 1912 was almost burnt into his palm. He also said that he couldn't understand why other people who were watching Titanic leaving were cheering as the ship rounded the corner, because for him it was a very sad occasion. His father was on board and he didn't know when he was going to see him again. And a couple of weeks later, the news came back to this very same place about what had happened to Titanic. And unfortunately for the Miller family, it wasn't good news, because Tommy wasn't amongst the survivors of Titanic. And his cousin Ella, who was just 12 at the time, was given the task of telling him that he was now an orphan. And she found him again on this beach, playing one of his favourite games. He used to sail a little paper boat, which he would make, and race it down the stream into the loch here. And just as she came to tell him about what had happened to Titanic, his little toy boat hit a rock and filled with water and sank. So that gave her a soft introduction to be able to tell him what had happened to Titanic out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. She said, "Oh, your wee boat has sunk. Do you remember the big boat that your dad sailed away on? Same thing happened to it. It hit an iceberg, a lot of people drowned, and your dad was drowned too." My grandfather didn't really understand, but he did know that he was probably not going to see his father again, and therefore the 2 pennies would have to be kept. So he did. He kept them all of his life as a memory of his father, who was so tragically lost on Titanic. My grandfather was raised by his great-aunt Mary in this thatched cottage in the village of Bonneybefore. She had 8 children of her own to bring up, so it was quite crowded in this little house. Undoubtedly she was helped a little by the 5 shillings a week she used to receive from the charitable Titanic Fund. And in 2012 the house was given a blue plaque to honour my grandfather, who grew up to be a playwright and author. And it's thanks to his words that we know so much about 1912 and the events leading up to Titanic's departure from Belfast, and also what happened